Well, welcome back once more to all my YouTube subscribers, and something completely different on my YouTube channel. Today we're going to take a look at some of the old archive footage from some of the Motocross Fallers from my 20 odd years of covering these motocross events. Now, many of these clips of course have been filmed in the old 4x3 video format, so please don't try and adjust your YouTube browser. And so our first victim of the day is Lee Waldy, and Lee is just about to show us just why you shouldn't build a motocross track with big posts and ropes. Now, Lee of course was perfectly okay after this amazing stunt, but he had a quite severe burn mark on his neck after this incident. Now, next up we have a modern rider from Knockhill Racing Circuit in Scotland who just takes an off-track excursion there. Now, this track in Knockhill in fact is now a car park, believe it or not. There's another rider hitting the deck. This track was actually bulldozed not long after these events and was made into a car park for the circuit. Scottish Classic Racing now. This is Lewis Bell on his CCM. Whoa! And as you can see, when Lewis was just making the turn, his front wheel hit a big stone that was buried and spat him off his big CCM. Next up we have John Mitchell on his 81 490 Micro at a Scottish Twinshock event in Dunoon in Scotland. And John once again hit that big hole in the mud and was unceremoniously spat off his Micro. Okay, next up we have Simon Watson of the famous Watson brothers. Simon just getting spat off his big JBR Honda at Kincardine in 1999. Now, here we have the Melville Motor Club Winter Scrambles. This big pile-up was in fact featured on ITV's You've Been Framed many years ago. As you can see, the rider number 17 just goes down and the rest of the pack just collect him, whereby a big crash ensues. Okay, next up another You've Been Framed TV classic. This is Richard Allen at Hoxton Park coming off his RM Suzuki. A very dusty event. As you can see, as Richard came over the tabletop, he got a really bad bounce on the top and got him all crossed up as he hit the deck on the other side, but Richard was perfectly fine after this incident. Next up, it's a turn of number 92. That's Ian Clark on his CCM Yamaha Hybrid. As Ian seems to get spat off the back of his big four-stroke machine. As you can see, it looks like Ian just got a handful of throttle and lost the front wheel, and he slid right off the back mudguard. And this was at a Scottish Twinshock event at Pound Mill. Now, these two riders, I don't know what was going on here, but this was a nostalgia scramble where one rider was overtaking another and seemed to get his leg for some reason jammed between the back wheel and mudguard of that other boy's bike, but they soon untangled themselves and got on with the job in hand. Okay, next up it's my old mate John McKell at a Scottish Twinshock event in Clackmannan. As you can see, John's front wheel just hits a bump there and spits him off his 490 Micro. Scottish Twinshocks again at Pennycook. Big pile-up in this over 40s class race. There seems to be bodies and bikes were just flying all over the place. Melville Winter Series Motocross again, and this KTM rider just seems to lose the front end and hits the very cold Melville dirt. Okay, next up this is Alan Anderson at a Scottish Twinshock event in Forfar in the north of the country. It just looks like Alan just didn't have enough speed to get round that berm on his 490 Micro. John McKell once again. John's always good for a little a little 490 Micro off. He slids into that corner and just loses balance completely. Next it's the turn of Steve Seavright at a Scottish Twinshock event at Dunoon on the west coast of Scotland. As you can see, Steve just comes round and just loses the bike completely. Scottish Motocross at Lookers in Fife. This KTM rider just loses the front end of the bike and goes down. Next up, Scottish Twinshocks at Pound Mill in Scotland. This is this is Gordon Forbes doing a little pirouette on his 490 Micro, very gracefully indeed. Now here is Scottish Twinshock champion Paul Chiappa getting taken out by his adversary and close friend Craig Smith. As you can see, Paul on the inside and Craig just cuts right across and says, take some of that. And Paul hasn't a clue what the hell's going on there. Scottish Classics now at Forfar. Now I don't know what this guy on this bike is all about like, but it just doesn't seem to know how to get that bike over that little crest at all, but he's given it a good try on the little CR125. Bye. Scottish Classics at Forfar again. And that rider number 44 there, that's the late John Bethel on his CCM having a collision with number 119 and taking him right out of the race. Now Scottish Modern Motocross again. This guy had just dropped his bike and was trying to pick it up when that guy just came right past and knocked his bike clean out of his hands. Oh, I can't wait to get this bike lifted up. It's so heavy. Bang. Oi! Okay, next up, this is Andy Mallock getting knocked off his big Armstrong 500. Looks like Andy got a bit tangled up in the ropes in that incident, but he was still fine. Okay, next up it's Dean Cox being knocked off his BSA at a Scottish Twinshock event in 2000 in Kincardine. Unfortunately, Dean was tragically killed in a motorcycle accident just 2 weeks after these videos were taken. Now this is Paul Chiappa at a practice event at Balmullo in Fife. And you can see there Paul got a bit crossed up in the ruts and he got completely spat off his 500 CR Honda. This was also used on the ITV's You've Been Framed channel many years ago. But the most important thing is, as you see Paul looking up just to make sure that I did actually manage to capture his little spill. Next up, this is Brian Allardyce on his 490 Micro. Scottish Twinshocks again at Clackmannan. As you can see, Brian just crests the hill and seems to lock the back brake up, whereby totally lost the back end and hit the deck. Next up, it's Craig Smith at a very wet Scottish Twinshock Dunoon event. This track at Dunoon was always wet, and it was a bit of a job trying to get round the track, never mind actually racing a bike. But there you see Craig taking a nice sit down on the job. Scottish Twinshocks again at Glenocle in Alloa, another very wet meeting in 2011. And this is the late Ian Robertson and Stuart Baird having a coming together in the extremely wet conditions at Glenacle in Alloa. As you see Ian on the outside there, the mud just totally changes his line and he runs right into the side of Stuart Baird. But both riders were perfectly fine. Scottish Twinshocks again at Windy Hill Farm in Kincardine. As this monoshock rider seems to have lost his way around the corner and took to hitting the post. But he was still perfectly fine. Now we're at Farleigh Castle now with this very bizarre motocross incident where the Kawasaki rider falls and number 71 also in a Kawasaki just lands right on top of him, but both of these riders were perfectly fine after this incident. Okay, next up it's a turn of Mike van der Meer on his 250 Michael at Cardenden in Fife. As you can see, Mike just gets his rhythm wrong and just loses control of that old Michael. Okay, next up this is Brian Littler on his 360 CZ at the Cumberland Grand National Scramble in Penrith. As you can see, Brian just seems to run into the back of Nigel Sowerby's Michael and this horrendous crash ensues. Now this motocross rider doesn't seem to know which side of the post that you're supposed to go around, but he seems okay after his little tumble. Now this is Richie McFadden and Tommy Anderson at Dunoon at a Scottish Twinshock scramble. Both riders coming round the corner and then it looks like Tommy Anderson took his front wheel and ran into the back of Richie McFadden's Husqvarna, and both riders then hit the deck. A very wet nostalgia scramble now as this rider couldn't make the turn at the the top of the hill and ended up against the fence, and although it looks funny, I'm glad the rider was still able to continue even in these very wet conditions at the nostalgia scramble. Now when conditions are wet, the last thing you want is another rider just knocking you off just like that. But this rider was doing his utmost and his very best to get up that hill, and although he must have had a slick back tyre on, this rider just washed his front wheel away and he went down. Okay, next up it's a turn of Ryan Bruce at a Scottish Twinshock event in Forfar. Ooh, nasty. As you can see, when Ryan approached the little jump, the back of his Honda just spat him high in the air right over the bars, and he came down on his shoulder and suffered a quite severe shoulder injury after this crash. And Ryan, not long after this, actually emigrated to Australia. Okay, next up it's Jim Colligan letting his 490 Michael cross the line before him, and he says I'll catch up with you later, as the bike crosses the line and Jim follows soon after. Okay, next up it's John Suter doing a little piece of ballet on his 4-stroke Suzuki. As you see, when John came through the ruts, he just got a bit crossed up and lost his balance momentarily, and did this very nice little smooth off. Okay, next up it's Jim Colligan once again with Callum Sangster at Pow Mill in Scotland. Both riders were going for the lead of this race, and as you can see, just handlebars just touched momentarily, which spat both riders onto the Pow Mill grass. Okay, next up it's Richard Charlton and Walter Bickmore at the Cumberland Grand National. And if you just look at Richard's left foot, where it gets caught underneath Walter's wheel and just washes the wheel from his bike, and Walter hits the deck. Next up, it's the famous steps at Farley Castle, and this is what happens if you can't stop at the bottom. Thank God for that chestnut fencing, it will stop you going through into the bushes. Just comes down a bit hot and can't stop at the bottom, and whoops. Now this is Scottish Twinshock champion again, Paul Chiappa's horrendous crash in 2006 at Kincardine. Now Paul was racing for the championship this day and was chasing Walter Bickmore for the title, and just seemed to get his front wheel caught in a rut whereby the bike folded up at the front and spat him into the woods. Paul had a serious injury after this, but he's still now back racing and just as fast as ever on this Michael. Another good friend of mine, number 122, that's Sean Docherty on his KX 450 Kawasaki at Glen Oakle in Alloa. And Sean once again at his home track at Gairloch Head on the west coast of Scotland. And that was Mark Wilson there that was chasing Sean in this race. Very quick rider, Sean. Now this clip is also at Pennycook in Scotland. Sean once again, as you can see, was having a very bad day there, and it looked like he had just about had enough of the wet and slippy conditions at Pennycook near Edinburgh. Next up, it's the World Twinshock Championships at Canada Heights, and look out for Wolfgang Schrader, the German Twinshock rider, coming through on your left hand side, totally off the line and causes an absolute major pile up in the very sandy conditions at Canada Heights. You can just see Wolfgang coming through there, number 3, just totally offline, and it causes all manner of mayhem to ensue. Of course, if you can't beat them, you can always just sit in the middle of the track and listen to a Jimmy Shand record, like the Scottish, like the Scottish rider's doing, as he's doing a little dance for us. Now, this KTM rider was actually leading the race up to this point, when he thought he was doing really well. And how many times has that happened to you when you think you're doing really well and this happens? Now this next race was on a frozen racetrack, which was in the middle of December at Glen Oakle in Alloa, and that's Stuart Baird, number 57, who's sliding off in the completely frozen conditions. But of course, if it's not frozen, it's too wet, as this Kawasaki rider is finding out. I know the days, I know the days. Next up is Jason Martin having a little coming together with a fellow rider at Lookers in Fife. As you can see, Jason on the left hand side. The two riders just collide and both riders hit the deck. Next up, it's Johnny Walker time. That's John Walker at a Scottish scramble event at Drumclog. As you can see, John comes up the hill and just gets the jump all wrong, but he was still perfectly fine. Now, the one thing you must not do when you're making a turn on a motocross bike is to take one hand off the bars and adjust your goggles, as this little Kawasaki rider is about to do. It's very hard to go round a corner on a motocross bike when you've only got one hand on the bars. Okay, next up it's the Melville Winter Motocross Series again. This rider just loses total control of his machine and does a complete flip. He makes the turn and comes round, gives it a handful of gas and just flips over. Another muddy scramble at Forfar once again. This Kawasaki rider just can't get to grip with the conditions. But isn't it annoying when you make a good start and then this happens? Another Kawasaki rider getting spat off his machine and slides along the mud. Next up it's William Penrice and Andy Bean at Pow Mill. And if you watch the slow-mo, as you can see, number 999, Willie Penrice hits the post with his hand and comes completely off his bike in front of Andy Bean, and both riders hit the deck. A little quad shunt now at the Melville Winter Motocross Series. Two riders come together and do synchronised dismounting. It's all good stuff. Next up it's Farley Castle once again. Number 10 there, and was doing actually quite well in that race when he got crossed up and ran into the back of one of the riders coming down the hill. Next up it's Morton Hanna at Glenocle in Alloa on his Evolution Honda. Morton was always good for a little shunt or two. And in this clip we can see Morton at his very best once again. Morton's ended up going across the track rather than forward. Scottish Classic Racing once again at Forfar. Another one of these riders who just clips the back wheel off the rider in front, and the inevitable, of course, happens. Next up is the turn of Alistair Dick at Dunoon on the west coast of Scotland. As you can see, once again, absolutely horrendous conditions at Dunoon. I don't think we ever had a meeting at Dunoon that was dry, but time for one of the Watson brothers now. This is Duncan Watson. Simon had his turn earlier on, so this is Duncan doing his bit for the video and ploughing through the ropes and the posts on his JBR Honda. Another Scottish Twinshock event at Dunoon in Scotland. Wet again, as you can see, but this little CR250 rider slid off, but when he picked his bike up the throttle was still going about half throttle, and you can see it'll just spun him round. Now a very embarrassed Twinshock rider here as he got his rear wheel stuck in the starting gate at Warmingham. And you can see Darren Hudson there having a good laugh, but how he did it I'm not exactly sure. Next up it's Ian Robertson and James McLean. Have a little coming together going up the hill, and if you just watch James going up the hill, he's looking back to see if Ian to see if Ian's actually going to collide with him, and Ian obliges him. But I hope you've enjoyed some of these video clips, and look out for more of the same in part 2. And thank you very much.